time to welcome to the studio from Envision Financial, Luke Smith. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, mate. How are you?
I'm well. It's a Friday afternoon, so we're feeling a little loose today. It's the end of a long week, I think.
Yeah, look, it is. I've just left the client's business, and the introduction was I've got lots to get through this afternoon. Some of it's fun, some of it we've got to do. And I said to him, well, where am I in that sort of scale? And he said, well, you're probably halfway between both of them. So.
Well, I guess you have to take the good with the bad, but that's a bit strange, isn't it?
It is.
We're here to talk finances today, and if you have a financial question, you can call in on 6255 1206 to ask that question. You can also send a text 0488 266 266 or email studio@2cc.net.au. Simple as that. So, what's happening? What are we talking about today?
Right, so today we're going to touch on the downsizing legislation, which I think is becoming more and more prevalent. I think it was probably a good time to chat about it leading into Christmas because, people often say springtime, summertime, good time to sell your house. Garden looks lovely, the roses are red. So we're going to touch on what the downsizing legislation is, how it works, some of the caveats that you have to keep in touch with, how people can use it and what it would mean in relation to your planning and some key things that people should consider before they jump out and do this.
All right, so what is the downsizing legislation and why was it created?
Yeah, so the downsizing legislation was brought in to give people the ability to sell their primary home and use some of those proceeds to make additional contributions to superannuation. So as we've touched on in previous shows, there are a few different key thresholds that we need to keep in mind when we're making contributions to super. Obviously, we have the $25,000 concessional cap, which is the most amount of money you can put into super and claim a deduction. And then there's the non-concessional cap, where no deduction is claimed, and that threshold is currently $100,000 per financial year, or $300,000 over a rolling 3-year period. The downsizing legislation is a maximum cap of $300,000 per person in your lifetime, where you are over the age of 65 and sell your primary home.
Right.
So a real life example could be you've lived in a property that's gone up in value, and generally speaking, from a capital perspective, a lot of people have a lot of wealth tied up in their primary home from a capital perspective.
Yes, and if they've lived there for a long time, it could be quite a lot of capital.
Exactly, and you look at the older generation now that have bought into suburbs that have become cool or have become central, and they know they've entered at a much lower price and can make the most of good timing and raising the kids in one place over 20 or 30 years. They can sell the house and put money into superannuation to try and bolster the capital base from which a pension can be commenced. So you've got your accumulated superannuation that you've been adding to over your working life, and then you decide, okay, I've got a $1.5 million house that we no longer live in or no longer need because the kids have all moved out. It's a massive 5-bedroom place. We're rattling around in it. I don't really want to clean it, keep it done and manage the gardens. We'd much rather downsize into a unit because we plan on going overseas for 6 to 8 months of the year. So in that sort of scenario, you sell the house, and then taking advantage of this legislation, you could put $300,000 per person into superannuation. It goes in as a tax-free contribution. It doesn't count towards your assessment of the non-concessional limit, which is $100,000 a year or $300 over 3 years. And it would allow you to get money into superannuation where someone is over the age of 65 and may not meet the work test.
All right.
Okay, so that's really important because under existing legislation, to put money into superannuation, the first test is, can you put the money in? Now, if you're under age 65, yes, you can. If you're over age 65, you have to meet the work test in the year you put the money in.
Which means you have to have a job.
Well, you have to work 40 hours in a 30-day period in a 12-month window.
Right.
Okay, now this contribution is exempt from that work test, so it's a very good way for those that have been retired for quite a while or newly retired and don't have the means to go and get short-term employment,
yes,
to be able to add to the capital base of superannuation with tax-free money and then build the base from which an income stream may be drawn by way of a pension to fund lifestyle and do the things you want to do.
It sounds like a really clever way of making use of the accumulated capital in your family home, especially when you don't need that home anymore. It's too clever for a politician to have thought of this. How did it come up?
Well, I think for me, it's more the legislation. You know, they throw you a bone here, right? So they realise, hang on, we've overshot and made it so hard to get money in.
Yeah.
A lot of people have a lot of capital value tied up in their primary home that obviously doesn't produce income. So it's not good from a retirement perspective. This is the sort of legislation that screams, wow, we've gone too far. Let's give the community, you know, a bit of a free kick and balance out our overzealous legislation in relation to getting money into super estate.
And of course, it does serve more than one purpose, because obviously the government has an interest in encouraging people to downsize so that it frees up property for the property market for younger families who want bigger homes for their growing families, and it helps the property market as well.
Yeah, look, exactly. The one thing I do obviously stress here is there are some very specific rules people need to be mindful of. Obviously, you need to be over the age of 65 to use this test. The money must go into superannuation within 90 days of settlement, okay? And there is very specific paperwork that needs to be lodged with your respective fund so that the super fund can treat it as the appropriate contribution and avoid any sort of confusion or application to other tests that we've talked about there between deductible and non-deductible. And obviously it needs to be your family home, and $300,000 is the maximum amount in your lifetime. So you can't sell and contribute, buy a new family home, sell and contribute. Once you've used it up, you've used it up. You could have multiple properties over your working life or your retirement life up to $300,000, that's fine. But you cannot put in excess of $300,000 into superannuation and claim this sort of exemption, no matter how many homes that you've lived in.
All right. How can people take advantage of this legislation when they're thinking about retirement?
Yeah, so some of the big ticket items here for me are really, one, how are we going to fund our retirement? You know, you may have been a little late to the party. We often find that the older generation didn't have the same superannuation support over their working life as kids have these days. So they haven't had that benefit of time and regular contributions. So obviously downsizing to buy a property that is appropriate for your retirement plans is a great way to free up, as you said, free up the accumulated capital in the property. So it's a really good way to bolster as a really like a last kicker to the asset base from which you're going to draw a tax-free income stream in retirement. It's a very good way to equalise your retirement planning. Now, that's very prevalent for people in the ACT who have CSS and PSS, DFRDB or MSBS pensions, because under the transfer balance cap limit of 1.6 million, if you retire from the government with a $100,000 pension in one of those four funds I've just listed, you're at your transfer balance cap. So you may not be able to make any additional non-concessional contributions, whereas you can still take advantage of this legislation. Your benefit contribution may be treated as an excess component, but you can still get it into superannuation, which going forwards is the biggest benefit from a concessional tax standpoint.
I suppose this could also be used as a way of adding to or creating superannuation for a spouse that didn't already have any.
Perfect. Yep, love your thinking. So really good example there where somebody may have stayed home and looked after the kids and they haven't made active contributions to superannuation. And it's one of those things that you need to think about how the money goes in, because whilst it's great to get it in, if you don't have any free cash flow and you could benefit from making a deductible contribution, then people should be thinking about how they best use the proceeds from the home sale and not just jumping straight into this piece of legislation. It is great, but always remember, look at your situation in totality and try and ensure that you maximise your deductible contributions first, and then take advantage of this sort of legislation to further bolster either your super, your spouse's super, or to create a super fund that could then be used for retirement income planning away from someone that may have, for example, a taxable pension from an employment arrangement. So looking at your planning situation in totality is really important, because if you can maximise the tax-free portion of somebody's asset base, obviously the better off you will be from a longevity standpoint and also from a tax standpoint in retirement. And that's where people should think about, obviously, what's accessible, and also, am I going to work?
Yes.
Another thing people should think about here is if there's one part of the team or the couple that may go back in contract, then obviously bolstering the superannuation in the non-worker's name could be advantageous from a tax planning perspective, but also then from an access standpoint, because they could free up superannuation and then have some income coming from either contracting or employment to look at your retirement income planning, cash flow in totality. So there's lots of ways that this can be used, and it's not just something that people should just race out and do.
Yes.
I would be looking at this as a bit of a finishing strategy where you've maximised all the other options, and then you go to something like this, and especially where you can't meet the work test, get your money into superannuation and then kick off a tax-free income stream.
You mentioned before that not everybody has had the benefit of the compulsory superannuation scheme throughout their working life, and of course it was only introduced by Paul Keating in the early 90s. So that's less than 30 years ago. So obviously there are people that are close to retirement that maybe don't have the full benefit because it didn't exist when they started their working career. So this is an excellent way of bolstering that shortfall.
Yeah, look, exactly. And again, from a planning standpoint, downsizing your home can free up the capital that a lot of people may not have had over their working life, depending on the nature of the way that they were employed. So to have, a couple of $100,000 floating around in some situations, I saw one last week that was over $1 million spare after the home had been bought, depending on what these people needed, because you've gone from a fairly large property to a unit that they could just come and go from.
Yes.
Because their priority was to be overseas and seeing things, not to then go and tie up capital in a property that they didn't intend to live in on the full-time basis. So it's really important that people look at this across the board and get money into super to try and maximise the amount of tax-free income they can take from super when they retire.
We're talking finance with Luke Smith from Envision Financial. It's about 13 to 5 now. News coming up at 5 o'clock. We'll be back with more finance in just a moment. Nine to 5 now on 2CC Canberra Live with Leon Delaney until 6 o'clock, and I'm joined this afternoon by Luke Smith from Envision Financial to talk all things finance. Today we're discussing the downsizing legislation that allows people to sell their principal place of residence, downsize to a smaller property, and use some of the proceeds to bolster their superannuation. So Luke, what should people consider to make the most of the downsizing legislation?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing they need to think about, as we touched on before the break, was maximise your other deductible opportunities first. Make the most of your tax deductions where you can. Obviously then, using this legislation to get money into super is very important because you can increase the capital base from which a tax-free income stream can be commenced. Think about your partner situation between the two of you. Where would you best be holding this money? And remember, there are going to be adverse Centrelink implications in some situations for people because the family home is currently exempt under the assets test for Centrelink, and if you go and liquidate a large portion of capital that then is assessable under the assets test, which cuts out at 8.30 off the top of my head, you could actually rob yourself of some age pension. So keep that in mind. As I say, don't race out and do this without considering your broader situation, because if you were getting full age pension, it may result in you actually getting no age pension, which could have other adverse implications for your situation. So be mindful of that, because the Centrelink implication here is quite significant.
Well, I would have said don't race out and do this without getting some solid professional advice.
Yeah, look, yeah, exactly right. It's important that people keep that in mind, because the Centrelink implications, whilst this legislation is fantastic, if you're not getting Centrelink, you're not really fussed about it. But when you look at the numbers and say, okay, I've got X amount of money in super and I can generate an income stream of Y,
yes,
and you compare that against the generosity of the pension system,
yes,
it can actually be detrimental to your broader cash flow position.
And of course, if you're having a part pension, there are other benefits as well with the concession cards and so forth.
Exactly right. So you need to think about this sort of stuff in totality, because I know my father-in-law's a big fan of a free fishing licence and a free gun licence. I'm not sure which one scares me more, because I'm married to his daughter. But I can't fish and he can shoot, so I don't think it's going to end well. But yeah, look, it's something that is a very, very significant. It's a very significant impost to have on your financial position when you're looking at your broader cash flow.
Yeah, so for some people that would actually be a major consideration about
Huge.
whether or not this is
Huge.
appropriate.
Yep.
Or you may be able to use the strategy, but just not all the cash.
Correct, and that's exactly right. You need to be able to think about what you're going to do, because that could then have a direct impact on the value of the next place you buy.
Yes.
So, you need to think about those things. And as we say on the show regularly, start with why and work backwards from there. For that means always the starting point. People should compare, obviously, their income needs against other working opportunities. So, obviously, as I said earlier, if you're going to be working and contracting or taking some part-time remuneration from somewhere, keep that in mind when you're thinking about whose name you invest money in. And also then obviously make sure that the super fund that you're going to use gives you the greatest flexibility and control over the way that you generate your income, because as we said in previous shows, it's not how much you generate, a lot of the time it's how you generate it. And obviously we've touched on franking credits in other shows because they are vitally important in a tax-free environment. And if you do have someone with a defined benefit income stream, think about maximising their superannuation so that you can make the most of the tax-free threshold that may be taken from the pension receiver, and by pension I mean CSS, DFRDB, PSS and MSBS, because they could be over their transfer balance cap, which could result in 15% tax on the earnings in some situations if a strategy is not put in place to remove that concessional tax.
And of course, to repeat an earlier point, it's with this particular strategy, it is vitally important that you make sure you do the right paperwork.
Oh, look, exactly right. I can't stress that enough. Putting the money into superannuation these days is just not enough. There's so many different ways that funds are trying to record your contributions. If you don't make the appropriate paperwork lodgements with the respective fund, and it's consistent across all funds, be it an industry fund, be it a personal super fund, be it a self-managed super fund, the auditor or the administrator of those funds is going to want to know how to treat it, because if you don't lodge the right paperwork, you could inadvertently rob yourself of the non-concession or contribution cap,
Yes.
which could be very detrimental to other broader strategies that you could be considering leading into or in retirement. So get your paperwork down. If you're not sure, make sure it's super tight or get someone to do it for you.
Well, as usual, where do we go for more information?
Well, look, exactly. www.envisionfinancial, that's envision with an E, .com.au. Obviously, we've got the library of information there in the resource centre. People are more than welcome to have access to that. You can also listen to the podcast. We've got the YouTube channel, Envision Financial Canberra, where people can subscribe and then have updates of the shows and the key takeouts of the information that we've talked about today. Or just give us a call in the office. Barb still makes a mean cup of coffee. We've got some really funky teas in there now, so if you're partial to a bubbly lemon tea or a ginger and chamomile, we've got it for you. So pop in, have a chat, and make sure you don't miss out on this great piece of legislation.
Fantastic. Luke Smith from Envision Financial. Thanks very much for popping by.
Thanks, mate.